Just like to welcome Peter this evening, Canon Librarian of the Cathedral. I don't quite know how you like to be addressed, but perhaps Peter is okay. Would you like to come up so we can have a little chat? Some people know you already, but there's one or two who don't. Welcome. It's a real delight to welcome you. I think it's a historical event this evening because, as far as I can tell, we've never had anybody from the staff of the Cathedral to speak here before, and it's well overdue. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
The Bishop of Norwich has been a great friend because his father was a Congregationalist, so there are many links, and in these days we all are on the same side. Could you tell us a little bit about, because the title sounds so interesting, Canon Librarian.
Oh, yes.
What do you actually do?
Well, I'm responsible for the educational ministry of the Cathedral. So, alongside the common commitment to the life of prayer and the governance of the Cathedral, which I share with the Dean and other canons, I oversee the children and schools work, the library, adult education and exhibitions, and a few other things which come along from time to time.
All right, sounds a very demanding job. So how many people do you think that the education touches, or in a year would you...
Well, it's difficult to number because, well, probably about, I think, 12 or 13,000 school children come in a year. We have several hundred who come for our adult education. The number, there will be thousands. Everyone who comes to the Cathedral goes through the exhibition space because that's the way in for visitors. So lots of people seeing what we're offering in terms of learning and education.
That's amazing. I do often go in the Cathedral, and I think I saw on one of your exhibition slides a year or so ago something about the old meeting. There's been links, hasn't there, in the past? I'm not quite sure how they were, but anyway, what sort of, apart from your activities at the Cathedral, what do you like to do for your free time? Do you have any?
I like to get out and see Norfolk.
Right. Yeah, you were telling me when we met about this Pilgrim's Trail that's going to be developed. I was very interested.
We hope. We're applying for European rural development funding to support waymarking of a pilgrimage path between Norwich and Walsingham. And we want to encourage people to engage with the life of pilgrimage, a great symbol of the Christian life. But we're conscious that pilgrimage is a way that many, many thousands of people around the world are engaging with faith. Most famously, in Europe anyway, at Santiago de Compostela, where hundreds of thousands of people every year make the pilgrimage. And it's a way, many of them aren't confessed Christians, but all those who choose to make such a journey with a purpose find that it has an enormous impact on them and in their lives. And it does enable many to turn to God and to find the life of His church. So we think it's really an important missionary opportunity we have to help people to engage with the life of faith. But it also is a huge opportunity for sustainable economic development for rural parts of Norfolk. Not many people know the Wensum Valley because there's no great tourist attraction there, but it's of great beauty and great value, and so we want to encourage people to see it and a walking pace.
So, what would be your oldest books in the Cathedral Library?
The oldest would be from the 15th century, but it has to be said they haven't always been at the Cathedral since the 15th century because we lost our monastic library at the Reformation. It was dispersed. And so this is a collection that we have currently is one that's been built up since the latter part of the 17th century, probably roughly about the same time that this meeting house was built.
And how many books in the library, roughly?
Well, in our historic collection, we have about 12,000. I mean, looking at Diana, because she's one of our library volunteers. She knows it very well. And but we also have inherited the library of the former Lincoln Theological College, and that has about 30,000 volumes, I think, in it. But it's an up-to-date theological collection, so it's a great resource for the region.
That's fantastic, because we are living in a time when lots of people are disregarding our spiritual heritage.
Indeed, so.
How do you feel that the cathedral can sort of help promote that? Because it's probably one of the most visited places in Norwich.
I think mostly by living it every day. We have a witness of prayer that's been going on for more than 900 years, morning and evening, and in between we are there faithfully offering prayers to God, praying for the needs of our world and for the needs of all who come among us. And of course we maintain our wonderful musical tradition in choral evensong and the sung Eucharist. It is a great heritage for which we're responsible, and we feel absolutely committed to continuing to witness to the world in that way.
Great. Well, I could talk for ages. He's such an interesting person, isn't he? Anyway, thank you so much, Peter. We'll give it over to you. And at the end, if you're open for questions.
Yes, of course. Thank you. Very happy. Some of you may be familiar with at least one of the movies of American film director Frank Capra. His best known is probably what's often called everyone's favorite Christmas film, It's a Wonderful Life, with James Stewart, the manager of a small town building society, facing financial ruin, contemplates suicide, only to be rescued by his guardian angel, Clarence, who shows him how the life of his town would have changed for the worse if he had never been born. One of Capra's other masterpieces is Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, in which Stewart, playing Jefferson Smith, an idealistic political innocent, is appointed senator and is promptly ensnared by his political opponents in corruption and graft. And in the depths of despair, he visits the Lincoln Memorial, seeking comfort and inspiration from the martyred president and his words from the Gettysburg Address that are carved on the walls of the memorial, that we may have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Throughout the film, the memorials and symbols of the monumental city stand as an accusatory counterpoint to the cynicism and corruption that are rife in the political city. And no, he's not talking about Washington right now. He's talking about Washington in 1930s. Now, you may be familiar with Washington as a visitor, but I was born there and spent the first 18 years of my life there, so I got to know it pretty well. But it was not until I went back after living some time in England that I began to see it with other eyes. I had thought that all the classical monuments, the Lincoln and Jefferson memorials, the Washington Monument, the Capitol, and the Supreme Court were built simply to be a reflection of Greek and Roman republican ideals. I had not recognized that they were also temples in the full sense of that word, as places of worship. When James Stewart, as Jefferson Smith, went to the Lincoln Memorial, he did so as to the shrine of a saint, to receive his guidance and blessing. The object of this civil religion is the nation itself. It has its temples and saints. It has its sacred objects that embody the virtues of the religion. The flag, to which every child pledges allegiance every day at school. The Capitol, the White House. It has its sacred scriptures in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, which are literally enshrined in the National Archives, venerated by patriotic pilgrims, and which are subject to intense and partisan critical interpretation by both fundamentalists and modernists. It has its holy days, Washington's and Lincoln's and Martin Luther King's birthdays, Memorial Day, the 4th of July, Thanksgiving. Within this larger religion are various lesser cults, one of which is the worship of guns. Its sacred text is the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which gives citizens the right to bear arms. Another competing cult is that of the Confederacy, those southern states that broke away from the North, precipitating the Civil War. The recent removal of some of the monuments sacred to its heroes have sparked vehement protests by white supremacists and other racists. And when you recognize that this civil religious faith is intimately bound up with the Christian faith to which most Americans remain attached, you can begin to understand why American religion can seem so contradictory and confusing, not only to outsiders, but also to many Americans. Under the Trump regime, the true spirit of this American faith is being bitterly contested. He and his supporters are trying to recover one traditional doctrine of America being created by and for white Americans. His opponents want to preserve the ideal of the nation as a place for people of all backgrounds and races, and as a beacon of hope to all nations and peoples. In either case, I would like to suggest that the doctrine of American exceptionalism, the whole notion of America as a land and the Americans as a people and nation chosen and favored by God, is fundamentally dangerous and harmful not only to other nations and peoples, but ultimately to Americans themselves. The doctrine of exceptionalism comes from this blending of civil and Christian faiths and is fundamental to the psyche of most Americans, even if they don't adhere to the Christian dimension of it. Without understanding this, we can't begin to make sense of the state that America is in now. But even if we understand its origins and variations, I suspect there isn't much that the rest of the world can do to change America's current course. It should be sobering to us gathered here that the predominant Puritanism of East Anglians in the early 17th century should be at the root of this distinctive American religiosity. Perhaps American exceptionalism is the ultimate expression of that well-known Norfolk motto, "Do different." Although the Puritans were far from being the first English settlers in North America, never mind the French and Spanish who were there even earlier, nevertheless it is the Puritan character which was most decisive in determining the character of American self-identity. The Puritans saw their flight from Old England to New England in terms of the ancient Israelites, liberation from slavery, with King Charles playing the role of Pharaoh, delivery across the water, the wanderings in the wilderness, and the conquest of Canaan. The clergy were their prophets who called their people back to the covenant when they strayed. As the Puritan storyline developed, it expressed itself in two separate versions, one emphasizing covenant and the other stressing conquest. The first lies at the root of the civil religion, while the other is at the root of the kind of religious nationalism expressed by Trump and his followers in its most recent expression. The covenant theology was so central to the Puritan mindset that they might as appropriately have called their new home New Israel rather than New England. It's worth pointing out, however briefly, that they were hardly alone in identifying themselves as God's chosen people. This was part of an international trend. The Spanish in Central and South America did the same, using contemporary reconstructions of the Temple of Solomon as the model for urban planning and church buildings. Also in the 17th century, the Moscow Patriarchate identified itself as the New Jerusalem, as well as the New Rome. As the United Kingdom developed as an imperial power in the 18th century, its identity as the new Israel was a constant theme. For evidence, we need look no farther than the series of oratorios that Handel composed for his patriotic London audiences: Saul, Israel in Egypt, Samson, Solomon, Judas Maccabeus, Messiah. There was no escaping the international obsession of each nation identifying itself as particular recipients of God's favor. And among all these, the United States alone has remained an imperial power with a sense of divine calling, and the Hebrew dimension of this vocation remains strong. This identity received its classic early expression in a lay sermon preached by the lawyer and colonial governor John Winthrop, as the Puritans were on the verge of leaving England for New England. If the settlers would be faithful to their covenant with God, he said, "We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, 'The Lord make it like that of New England.' For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us, so that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." Now, it's not hard to see why this city on the hill text has so resonated with Americans down the ages. It displays that overweening confidence that the eyes of the world would be upon the fate of these few hundred colonists. It seems to prophesy the way in which America, in its size and wealth and power, would become the admiration and envy of the whole world. But it also anticipates the way in which America's sense of itself would have an inward focus, that its greatness would be for its own benefit as a chosen people and nation, rather than for the benefit of other peoples. They would subjugate and destroy the native peoples of the lands as the ancient Israelites did, and they would enslave other peoples in order to capture the wealth of the land for the sake of its conquerors. Scholars call this American identity Hebraic for the sake of its biblical origins, but I think that the term also resonates with its strongly introverted perspective, in contrast to the New Covenant that embraces Gentiles as well as Jews and is universal in scope. In the course of the 17th century and its bloody wars with the Indians, American religious discourse would also acquire its distinctive strains of religious nationalism, echoing the bloody conquest of Canaan with a narrative of blood sacrifice, blood belonging, and sacred lands. In this later 17th century narrative, we see already the sacralizing of the armed forces that is still very much in evidence today, and a violent reading of texts in Revelation. The leading Puritan theologian, Cotton Mather, looked for Christ to return in glory and settle accounts with the enemies of the faithful. He said in one sermon, "At no time in his vision of the end did St. John ever describe Christ's second coming as occurring in harmony and peace. Christ would descend upon the earth in smoke and fire with his angels, and the fire would rain down on degenerate men everywhere, and the heavens would be set on fire to torment the devils there." Here is the voice that would find its modern expression in the best-selling Left Behind novels about the millennial rapture by Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins. If you've never heard of them, around the millennium they were best-selling novels, a series of them, about a dozen, which sold in their millions and millions. As the American colonies moved toward independence from Great Britain, the Hebraic identity proved to be quite a flexible friend, since one strain of the Hebrew tradition strongly opposed the people having any king other than God himself. although modern-day secularists vehemently argue that the War of Independence and the framing of the US Constitution were profoundly secular movements, I think their arguments amount to special pleading, deliberately neglecting the abundant evidence of the centrality of the religious foundations of the new republic. Even the atheist Thomas Paine, yet another Norfolk man, in his seminal pamphlet Common Sense, made his argument for American independence from the biblical book of Judges and the prophet Samuel. Paine, even if himself an atheist, knew what his audience would regard as authoritative. What I hold to be the single boldest claim made in the Declaration of Independence, that it is a self-evident truth that all men are created equal, has been cited as evidence of a radical secularism at the heart of the American project. But in fact, that principle emerges into the Declaration from the writings of the political philosopher John Locke, who insisted that all men were equal, but only in the eyes of their Creator, of God, and not in the eyes of their fellow human beings. Likewise, the widespread secular assumption that the constitutional provision for the separation of church and state represented opposition to religious influences in public life is also profoundly misleading. To say, as the US Constitution does, that the federal government could not make a national church establishment, as in England and Scotland, did not deny that power to individual states, which, particularly in Puritan New England, continued to have established churches for another 50 years. Nor did the Constitution create any dividing line between religion and politics. Protestant Christianity remained an essential building block of American national identity from the beginning and remains powerful to this day, whether for good or for ill. The Bible was at the root of the very powerful ideals which have shaped the American project, but there has been a disconnection between the articulation of these ideals and their realization. Americans have been tempted to claim that the kingdom of God has been realized in the United States, but the reality has always fallen short of the rhetoric, particularly for those not of the white Protestant ruling elite. The American Civil War, and I'm compressing things here, was the crucible in which the modern identity of the United States was formed. It was the first modern industrial war, and per capita of the population it was much more costly in human life than either the First or the Second World Wars. That is, for Americans. It was a fulfillment of the religious nationalism that had begun to be expressed in the colonial period, but it also set two forms of religious nationalism against one another. On both sides, however, the deaths of soldiers were celebrated as a form of blood sacrifice. Battlefields were declared consecrated by the blood of the fallen soldiers, and bloody battle relics were deemed sacred objects suitable for public veneration. The war was an apocalyptic event, evidence of divine justice that was punishing, according to which side you were on, either the original American sin of slavery or the unnatural doctrine of the equality of black and white people. Even to this day, Julia Ward Howe's Battle Hymn of the Republic, in its fierce rhetoric, expresses the deep yearning for the nation to be cleansed by the blood of sacrifice. It represents the seamless elision of the nation's religious and political values. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He hath loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The final verse concludes, in the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free, while God is marching on. glory, glory, hallelujah. It carries the conviction that even in warfare and violence, perhaps particularly in warfare and violence, the American people were making manifest their identity as God's chosen people, charged with the responsibility of righting the world's wrongs. And ultimately, in the period of Reconstruction, it was this culture of blood sacrifice that would reunite the white cultures of North and South on Memorial Day and on battle anniversaries, when people gathered to celebrate the mingled blood that had been shed. In the interests of national reconciliation, slavery was gradually omitted from public discourse of the war, and black Americans were excluded from public commemorations. Throughout these centuries, black Americans were virtually without a public voice. The black abolitionist Frederick Douglass was a notable exception, but the first black public theologian was W.E.B. Du Bois at the turn of the 20th century. Subversively, Du Bois claimed the rhetoric of the covenant and the civil religion for black Americans, suggesting that it was they, rather than the Puritans, who were the real founders and by their labor and the true builders of America, reminding whites of the slaves who came with the Virginia settlers. He asked, "Your country, how came it yours? Before the Pilgrims landed, we were here." Du Bois claimed for black slaves the true heritage of the Israelites and insisted that it was the blacks who were the saving remnant that had shielded a white nation from divine retribution. There has run in the heart of black folk the greatest of human achievements, love and sympathy, even for their enemies, for those who despised them and hurt them and did them nameless ill. They have nursed the sick and closed the staring eyes of the dead. They have given friendship to the friendless. They have shared the pittance of their poverty with the outcast and nameless. They have been good and true and pitiful to the bad and false. In this way, Du Bois paid tribute to the continuing sacrifices offered by the oppressed people, and anticipated the themes of black liberation theology that would be articulated most completely by Martin Luther King in the civil rights era. Within my own lifetime, the task of refreshing the best of the American covenant has largely fallen to black Americans who have been consistently shut out from the mainstream of national life, both by white hostility and white indifference. After World War II, and especially after the fall of communism, the American political establishment was content to regard American military, financial, and cultural hegemony as the fulfillment of American exceptionalism and the status of the United States as God's chosen nation. If blacks had not raised their voices in protest to insist that the American covenant of equality for its own people remained unfinished business, nothing more would have been done to address it. Perhaps surprisingly, Martin Luther King himself consistently spoke and preached in terms of American exceptionalism. Perhaps he had to, in order to be heard by those who wielded power. Only if he pricked their consciences, spoke their language, spoke of their shared traditions, might they listen to him. He spoke of the American dream not in terms of the culture of post-war material ease, but in the almost forgotten language of the Puritans and the revolutionary founders. He said, "The substance of the dream is expressed in these sublime words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Echoing the Puritans, he said, God somehow called America to do a special job for mankind and the world. Never before in the history of the world have so many racial groups and so many national backgrounds assembled together in one nation. And somehow, if we can't solve the problem in America, then the world can't solve the problem, because America is the world in miniature, and the world is America writ large. Like John Winthrop, King yearned after that city on the hill to be an example to the world, and he warned of God's wrath if they should fail. The judgment of God is upon us, and we must either learn to live together as brothers, or we are all going to perish as fools. And now we live in an era when all the gains of the civil rights era that we had come to take for granted now seem to be up for grabs again. For me, the symbolic moment was when Dylan Roof, the white supremacist who in 2015 entered a black church in Charleston, South Carolina, sat in a prayer meeting and then killed 9 people. In the most symbolically powerful gesture of his presidency, Barack Obama at the funeral started singing solo, Amazing Grace, the hymn of John Newton, the slave ship captain who repented and became an Anglican priest. His hymn became a touchstone of the African-American spiritual tradition, but in this context, it was as much a lament of trust betrayed, yet again, as well as an expression of trust in God. The shame is that now the president is a man who deliberately divides rather than unites the nation, and yet at the foundation of his supporters are evangelical Christians. Why do some Christians support Trump? Part of the calculus is straightforwardly political. They consider him the most evangelical-friendly United States president ever. On all their key issues, conservative appointments to the courts, pro-life policies, the American embassy in Jerusalem, his disdain for political correctness, Trump is marching to their tune. If his behavior is wayward, well, the Bible is full of flawed heroes, and the Donald, they say, is just another one of them. On the other hand, those evangelical Christians who oppose Trump are beginning to find themselves unable to apply the label evangelical to themselves. The longtime servant of Republican administrations and commentator Peter Weiner has recently written in the New York Times, "The other day I received a note from a friend of mine, a pastor, who told me he no longer uses the label evangelical to describe himself, even though he meets every element of its historical definition, because the term is now so stained as to ruin my ability to be what evangelicalism was supposed to be." For such, evangelical is now more a political label or tribal description than a religious identification. Thus, the divisions over Trump are separating even previously solid and predictable communities and voting blocs. Far from there being a separation between religion and politics in the United States, they remain inseparably linked together. Even if we leave Trump's religious alliances aside, I would still be concerned that America's civil religious tradition distorts the nation's self-understanding and its religious life in an unhealthy way. The country's historic commitment to human freedom, equality, and justice are precious treasures in the story of humankind. But as soon as those values become introverted, the possession of a supposedly chosen people, those values become distorted and idolatrous. They discourage people from thinking critically about their own values and actions, make them impervious to legitimate criticisms by friends and foe alike. America's recent policies in the Middle East, with its naive assumption that American values and lifestyle are the admiration of every other people and culture, or that democratic values can be promoted by means of judicial torture or by the use of depleted uranium weapons, all the while appointing sanctimonious fingers of blame at Putin or Assad. These demonstrate a shocking lack of regard for the very principles at the heart of its own sacred texts. If the city on a hill chooses to isolate itself from its neighbours, denying common values and traditions, it can become a very lonely and alienating place. Without accountability to any authority beyond itself, America's civil religion, however noble in itself, runs the risk of becoming idolatrous, also poisoning the wells of the Christian faith that is at the root of its civil religious values. I would also argue that even those denominations that stand distinct from American evangelicalism, like the Episcopalians and the Roman Catholics, can also be infected by their own forms of American exceptionalism. The growing disregard of the Episcopal Church for the views of other members of the Anglican Communion is evidence of a denial of accountability to their brothers and sisters in Christ worldwide, of a cultural imperialism and a lack of humility that is destructive not only of relations with sister churches, but also of its own internal coherence. Benjamin Guyer, a scholar who, with Paul Avis, is the author and editors of a recent history of the Lambeth Conference, observes, "I fear that American culture wars have basically been exported to the wider Anglican Communion. As our culture wars continue to intensify, perhaps the best thing for the Anglican Communion is to figure out how to control the American wild cards, whether in the Episcopal Church or in the Anglican diaspora. Because Americans, and thus all American churches, have so much money, they have immense global influence, and that influence can be used in a truly destructive manner, and feuding American groups have indeed used that influence destructively." Thus, we are reminded that Trump's destructive tendencies, far from being unique to him, are characteristic of an American myopia which takes its own concerns as determinative for the rest of the world. Just as Trump is prepared wantonly to destroy the fabric of international alliances that have maintained peace in Europe and relative stability elsewhere in our world, so our American co-religionists seem prepared to break up the Anglican Communion in pursuit of their own sectarian agendas. And indeed, comparable forces in Roman Catholicism in the United States are also at the heart of our opposition to the reforming agenda of Pope Francis. There is once again this export of American cultural wars to the rest of the world. Being a transplanted American, you might wonder why I might find myself serving within the Church of England. The only way I can describe it is that I started off, even as a young person, as a normal American Anglophile. But I hope I've been here long enough, almost 32 years now, 23 of them in orders, not to see things through rose-tinted spectacles any longer. As I've been reflecting on American disruptive influences in the Anglican Communion, it's worth reminding ourselves that the Church of England laid the foundation for structural weakness in the Communion in the first place by using our missionary societies to export our churchmanship divisions between low, broad, and high church throughout the British Empire. But I think I can date an intellectual and spiritual conversion to the Church of England fairly precisely, to when I was a first-year undergraduate in early 1981 and studying Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France. In contrast to the destructive and utopian excesses of the French revolutionaries who had executed their king, dissolved their historic institutions, and purported to start human history from an entirely new beginning, Edmund Burke extolled the covenant that he saw lying at the heart of English history and culture, and described its society as a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. Each contract of each particular state is but a clause in the great primeval contract of eternal society. That made entire sense to me then, and I think it is still the essential glue that holds this country together. Despite all the changes that have taken place here, the Church of England is still an integral ingredient in that glue. We need only look back at the royal wedding this summer, which was a marvelous demonstration of the way in which the Church gives the nation the opportunity ceremonially to examine itself, to take account of new realities, and yet still remain essentially true to itself. If I were to express that partnership between the living, the dead, and those yet to be born in theological terms, I would say that that is as good a definition of the communion of saints as I've heard. Its strength is that it's not a closed system. It is accountable not only to the living, but also to the past and to the future. It is an organic system, relaxed about being a bit makeshift and adaptive. It's a patchwork, like our parish churches, reflecting change and development over time. Such a theology, I think, has a better chance of remaining relevant than one that is so caught up in its sense of its own exceptionalism and being chosen by God that it cannot afford to admit its failure to live up to its own standards. All that being said, and for all my efforts at debunking the American dream, I fear that although you can take the boy out of America, you can't take America out of the boy. Frank Capra's vision of an inclusive, generous, and neighbourly America, offering opportunity to all, is still wired into my DNA. If I ever fancied myself as a star in a movie, I wouldn't want to be James Bond, for an example. I'd be somebody like Jefferson Smith, in all his naive, bumbling idealism, fighting against the forces of corruption and despair. And so, in conclusion, I turn to some other words Smith saw carved on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial for evidence of the best of America's civil religion, convinced that if Americans could commit themselves to these values, then they hold the best hope for America's future and thus also for the world's future. The words conclude Lincoln's second inaugural address. With malice towards none, so I should add that he made this address in 1864, towards the end of the American Civil War. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thank you.
Any questions, anyone, please?
It was wonderfully thought-provoking,
Yes.
and raised so many issues, which is great. The hard part to me is that we find it difficult to understand America, I think, and you've shown some of the reasons why, some of the complexities there. Couple of things. Would you say that the black churches are, in a sense, the real inheritors of Puritanism as it was?
Well, I mean, the Puritanism and its legacy is such a mixed one.
Yeah.
And so...
You see it more in them, would you say?
Well, I mean, I would see much of the best of that legacy there, certainly. But there's also this kind of nationalistic, the seeds of the nationalism were also in the Puritan legacy as well. And so it's in a sense that, America is at war with itself over the terms of that legacy, and which are the bits that are worth holding on to, and which are the bits which are should be neglected. And in a sense, after the civil rights movement, I guess we all thought that the battle had been won, as it were, and that that nationalism, that destructive nationalism, was fading away. But it never really did. It just went onto the surface, as it were, and has clearly emerged again. And the covenant tradition, as it's described, is facing the kind of challenges that nobody ever envisaged would arise again. It's these the ironies of history. Yes, Michael.
It's a very, very difficult question. You haven't actually used the word democracy. I'm very confused about democracy.
That's an interesting observation and reflection. And I suppose because I was trying to do a theological assessment, that the political science vocabulary didn't naturally arise. And of course, democracy itself can have many meanings. That on a recent visit back to America, I managed to see the musical Hamilton, which is now in London, has been a huge popular success. But in that context, it was interesting to see in which the author, the dramatist, was encouraging people to remember the way in which, the different ways in which democracy has been understood in American history, and that Hamilton himself was a federalist and was suspicious of the idea of democracy because he saw in it, the possibility of mob rule, as it were, the unwashed people, as it were, asserting control, whereas the Jefferson Republicans, as they were known then, were very much supportive of the idea of popular rule, and were supportive of what they saw happening in the French Revolution, for example. So democracy itself has quite a mixed heritage within American history, and I wouldn't like to try to imagine how democracy and the Puritan inheritance have intertwined with one another. It would be more complex than I can get my brain around it at the moment.
And the peculiarity of the American system, giving those smaller states a say.
Yes.
I was having lunch yesterday with somebody from Washington.
Yes.
He was pointing out, of course, Trump was about 3 million behind in terms of the popular vote.
Yes.
When he won the presidency.
Yes.
So if that's democracy.
Well, indeed, and in the recent midterm elections, that although apparently the Democrats scored 12 million more votes nationally, yet overall that they might be seen as the losers in the election because the Republicans have gained representation in the Senate, because largely thanks to these, although geographically large in terms of population, smaller rural states in the Midwest, which have very voting very conservative at the moment. And that was, in terms of the Constitution, one of the things that the Founding Fathers wanted to preserve was, in a sense, a tension between the power of democracy in terms of the popular will and the power of the states themselves, to maintain their identities within a federal system.
Right, well, thanks again. I was very challenged by some of the things that you said, and hopefully the recording will have worked. And when I can get my son to do it, he will put it up on the website. And I'm needing to listen again because there was just so much in the talk that was very stimulating. So thank you ever so much for coming.
Well, thank you for your invitation.